was that if I have made the wrong call, not only will I switch my vote, he'd been lobbying, of course, for more quantitative easing, but he said he would not pursue a second term. They should have someone who gets it right and not me. I am accountable for my actions. Well, joining me now to discuss this at the Gherkin is the economist, Professor John Kay. Professor Kay, goodness, the prediction of 1.5% by July, it's not going to happen now, is it?
It doesn't look likely. And what you've described must be something of a first, actually, of an economist standing by his prediction.
Yes, you've got to admire, in that sense, the boldness of, because economists' predictions are often wrong, aren't they?
Well, rather frequently, so yes. In fact, people say economists often disagree, but in fact, it turns out that their forecasts are more like each other's forecasts than they are like the actual reality.
Indeed, the consensus is often there often is a consensus around a number, isn't there? This issue, though, about I suppose what's happened in the last few months in particular. Why is inflation not coming back towards target in the way in which the Bank of England said it would?
Well, I think it probably is. It's just happening a bit more slowly, and people emphasising the news today, 0.2% on the inflation rate, 0.2% on the growth rate. All of that is really people in markets trying to tell stories and making things out of very small numbers. 0.2% on prices is not something you or I are going to notice. Similarly, 0.2% on growth. The real test will be, does inflation keep falling through this year? And we'll see that in 3 or 4 months.
And Barclays Capital this evening is suggesting that probably it won't. It thinks that inflation will be about 3% come Christmas.
If they're right, then we really are in a much more serious game. But I think we have to wait and see and not just project this month into the future.
When you look at something like the oil price, does that give you any cause for concern that perhaps that there are these costs that no one was expecting? The oil price is higher than...
Well, there are always these commodity elements that are really outside anyone's control. You heard the argument today that it was what happened to food prices, not now, but a year ago, that is responsible for this month's inflation rate figures. So we're always getting, as it were, noise and froth that come from movements in commodity prices. And that's one of the reasons why it's really quite hard to predict.
I sense you're very relaxed about all this, and that you don't really sense that we have an inflation problem as such.
I don't think we have an inflation problem now. I think we have a lot of economic problems sitting around, but I don't think inflation's an immediate worry. It may turn out to be a worry as financial developments unfold. And I think some of your other items on the news are nervous about how financial developments will unfold, and I think they're right to be nervous.
We'll come on to that in a minute, because as you mentioned, the IMF's latest set of forecasts probably won't tell us about what happens in the future. In fact, what the IMF tends to forecast tends not to happen. But they do talk about a returning, some confidence, some optimism has returned. You don't sound very optimistic. Why not?
I don't sound very optimistic, but what we're seeing there, I think, is what we've been seeing quite often recently, which is if you get down at the micro level and talk to individual companies, things really aren't too bad. They're quite optimistic. They're making profits. But then if you look at the overall macro scene, the way we haven't solved our financial crisis and the way the Eurozone crisis continues and will continue to unfold, I think one's bound to be very nervous about the macroeconomic prospects in aggregate.
You say it will continue to unfold, but the central, the sense you get listening to the IMF and the speeches that they make is that, the subtext there is that they probably sense that the worst is over.
I think they're wrong, right? And I think people have kept using this metaphor, kicking the can down the road, and actually it takes more and more effort each time to kick the can a little bit further down the road. The end of last year, the European Central Bank gave extraordinary amounts of money, hundreds of billions of pounds, to Europe's banks. That's money they will find it very hard ever to recover. And it looks like we've bought 3 months respite.
Well, why do you say
all
they
of
won't
that
be
money.
getting that money back, or some of that money back?
Because many of these banks are bust, basically. And if the euro crisis gets worse, they will be more bust. The idea that we're going to be in 3 years' time in a position where the central bank can take money out of the system again is, I think, very improbable indeed.
But and the bill in that eventuality would rest with taxpayers across the Eurozone, but presumably that's a burden that they can shoulder, isn't it? I mean, it need not mean economic meltdown.
It's a burden they can shoulder. It's a burden. The question is whether it's a burden they will shoulder. There are two ways out of the Eurozone problem. One is basically that Germany and some of the other Northern European countries sign a blank check. And the other is that we go through years and years and years of the kind of austerity we're seeing in Spain, Greece, and other countries in the south. And I don't think either of these scenarios is going to be politically saleable to people in these countries. That's the key Eurozone problem. And I think we've now reached a stage where I can't see a solution to it.
Okay. On that note, let's leave it. Professor John Kay, thank you very much for joining us on to talk about that. This is Jeff Randall Live, coming up after the break.